My name is Walter Kowalski, and I'm 63 years old. If you're just starting this story, I want you to understand something before I say another word. What I'm about to tell you isn't easy to share. It took me a long time to be able to talk about it without my hands shaking, but I'm sharing it because I believe it needs to be heard. Because what happened in my father's home, in that little bungalow on the edge of Sudbury, Ontario, could be happening right now in a house on your street to someone you care about. This is a story about family, about trust, and about what happens when the person you place that trust in turns out to be someone you never actually knew. I spent 31 years working as a mining engineer at Vale's Sudbury operation. Retired 4 years ago with a decent pension, a bad left knee, and more free time than I knew what to do with. My wife Carol passed away from a stroke 6 years back. It's just me now in our house on Algonquin Road, me in too many empty rooms, and a dog named Birch who's getting on in years himself. My daughter Melissa lives in Ottawa with her husband and my 2 grandkids. She drives up when she can. My son Kevin is out in Calgary working in oil and gas. We talk on the phone every couple of weeks. My father, Arthur, turned 84 last March. He spent his whole working life at the paper mill up near Espanola and retired with the kind of quiet dignity that men of his generation had about them. He built his own bungalow by hand in the 1970s on a half-acre lot on the east side of Sudbury, and he never left it. After my mother passed 12 years ago, Dad lived alone, managing his garden, watching hockey, arguing with the television during federal elections. Sharp as a tack, independent, proud. Then around 2.5 years ago, we started noticing things. He'd call me by my mother's brother's name sometimes. He'd forget we'd already spoken that day and call back an hour later to tell me the same piece of news. He left his truck running in the driveway for 3 hours one afternoon because he walked inside and simply forgot he'd driven anywhere. The doctor at his family practice in Sudbury ran some tests and told us what we already suspected: early stage Alzheimer's. Not severe. He still knew who we were, still had most of his personality, still got around fine physically. But he needed supervision. He couldn't be alone anymore. That's when my sister Diane came into the picture. Diane is 5 years younger than me. She'd been living down in Toronto for most of her adult life, but her marriage ended badly about 3 years ago. Ugly divorce. Her ex-husband kept the house they owned in Mississauga, and Diane found herself renting a small apartment in Etobicoke on what was left of their shared finances. She'd been working part-time, doing bookkeeping for a dental practice. Nothing stable. Nothing with benefits. When Dad's diagnosis came through and we started talking about what to do next, Diane called me one evening and said she'd been thinking. She wanted to move into Dad's bungalow. She'd be there to look after him. His place had that extra bedroom that had been sitting empty since Kevin moved out in the 90s. She'd help with his meals, his medications, his appointments. She'd be there full time. It would save Dad from going into a facility, which none of us wanted, and it would give Diane a place to land while she got back on her feet. I want you to understand how reasonable this sounded, how generous. I called Melissa that night, and she thought it was a wonderful idea. I called Kevin, who said it made perfect sense. The 3 of us even talked about contributing a bit of money each month to help cover Diane's expenses, since she'd essentially be acting as Dad's caregiver. We set up an arrangement where a small amount came from each of us into a shared account Diane could access. For groceries, utilities, anything Dad needed. I helped Diane move in on a Saturday in early October. I carried boxes, assembled a new bookshelf for the spare room, made chili for dinner. Dad seemed happy to have company. He sat at the kitchen table and watched us work and made jokes the way he always used to, calling Diane by the nickname he'd given her as a kid, Pee-wee. She laughed and told him to stop, and everything felt warm and right. I drove home that evening, feeling like we'd done something good for our family. The first month was fine. I'd drop by 2 or 3 times a week after my morning walk with Birch. Dad and I would have coffee and do the crossword together, or watch the morning news and complain about the same things we'd always complained about. Diane was usually around, making breakfast or tidying up. She seemed settled, happy even. She'd enrolled in an online bookkeeping course, mentioned she was applying for some remote work contracts. Things seemed to be moving in the right direction. Then, Somewhere in November, things began to shift. It was gradual enough that I almost didn't register it at first. I'd come by on a Tuesday morning, and Dad would seem more tired than usual. He'd only eaten half his breakfast, pushed the rest away. He was losing a bit of weight, which I noticed in his face and in the way his shirts were starting to hang loose across the shoulders. He told me he wasn't sleeping well. I chalked it up to the season. November in Sudbury gets dark and cold fast, and Dad had always struggled a bit with the shorter days. But then there was something else, something harder to explain. When Diane came into the room, Dad changed. It was subtle, but unmistakable once I started seeing it. He'd go quieter. His hands would still on whatever he was holding. He'd look toward the window instead of at her. One morning, I came in through the side door, and Dad was sitting at the kitchen table alone, and when I said his name, his whole body startled like I'd fired a gun. He laughed it off, said he was getting jumpy in his old age, but his hand was pressed flat against his chest, where his heart was. I asked myself if I was imagining things. I told myself Dad was adjusting to a new routine, that sharing his space with someone after 12 years alone was an adjustment for a man his age. I kept visiting, kept watching. Then one morning in early December, I came by unannounced. I'd woken up early and had nothing planned and thought I'd surprise Dad with a box of Timbits from the drive-thru on LaSalle. I used my key and came in through the front. Diane's car was in the driveway. I could hear the television on in the living room. I found Dad in his armchair with a blanket pulled up to his chest, even though the house was warm. He looked at me when I came in, and his face did something I hadn't seen it do in a long time. It crumpled, just for a second, just long enough for me to catch it before he smoothed it over and managed a smile. "Walter," he said, "you didn't call first." "Thought I'd surprise you," I said, holding up the Timbits box. "You okay, Dad?" "Fine," he said. "Just tired." His left forearm was resting on the arm of the chair, and as I got closer, I saw it. A bruise just below the elbow, mottled yellow and purple, maybe 4 centimeters across. Not fresh. A few days old, at least. I set the Timbits down on the coffee table and sat on the edge of the couch. "Dad, what happened to your arm?" He looked down at it like he was seeing it for the first time. "Must have bumped into something," he said. "You know how clumsy I get." "That doesn't look like a bump," I said. "That looks like something grabbed you." His jaw tightened. "Walt, don't fuss." He said it the way he used to when I was 11 years old and asking too many questions. The voice that meant the subject was closed. I heard Diane in the kitchen then, running the water at the sink. I looked toward the hallway and then back at Dad. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at the television. I stayed for an hour that morning. Diane was pleasant enough, made us all tea, sat with us for a bit before saying she had things to get on with. But I noticed she glanced at Dad's arm when she sat down, just a flicker, and then looked away quickly. And I noticed that Dad did not eat a single one of the Timbits I'd brought. I drove home thinking about that bruise, thinking about the way Dad had looked when I walked in, thinking about the way his body had settled somehow when Diane left the room. I started coming by more often, every day when I could. And the more I was there, the more I saw. There were 2 more bruises over the following 3 weeks. One on his right shin that he said was from the corner of the coffee table. One on his upper arm, which he couldn't explain at all, just waved his hand and said he didn't know. He was eating less. I started bringing food, homemade soup, sandwiches, and watched him eat more with me there in an hour than Diane told me he'd eaten all morning. One evening I was there past dinner time. I'd fixed the latch on the back gate that had been sticking, and it was getting dark by the time I came back in. Dad was in his armchair, and Diane was out, a book club meeting she mentioned, and without Diane in the house, something loosened in my father. He talked more, laughed at something on the news, ate a full bowl of the soup I'd reheated. I sat across from him and watched this man who'd raised me come back to life a little, just from having me there and her gone, and I felt something cold settle into my chest. "Dad," I said carefully, "is everything okay here? With Diane?" He looked at me for a long moment. The television murmured between us. "She does a lot for me," he said finally. "I know she does," I said. "But that's not what I asked." He looked back at the television. "I'm fine, Walt. Don't go making trouble." But his voice had gone small. The same small voice I'd been hearing more and more. And before he could close the subject again, I said, "Dad, you can tell me anything. You know that, right? Whatever it is, I'm on your side." "I'm always on your side." He was quiet for so long I thought he'd decided not to answer. Then he said, without looking at me, "I just wish things were a little quieter at night." "What do you mean, quieter?" He shook his head. "Never mind. I'm tired, Walt. Think I'll head to bed." That was the moment I knew. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and I thought about those bruises. I thought about the weight loss. I thought about what it meant that my 84-year-old father slept better and ate more and breathed easier when his sister wasn't in the house. I thought about what he'd said about the nights. I wanted to confront Diane. Everything in me wanted to drive over there and pound on the door and demand answers. But I sat with that impulse, and I let it pass. Because I knew Diane. She was smart, and she was quick. And if I came at her with accusations I couldn't prove, she would deny everything with complete conviction. And then she would be angry, and Dad would be left alone in that house with her anger. I needed proof. I needed something that couldn't be explained away. I called a lawyer the next day. Her name was Patricia Holmberg, a family law and elder law attorney based in Sudbury. I'd gotten her name from a colleague who'd used her during his own difficult family situation a few years back. I met with her in her office on Elm Street, and I told her everything I'd observed. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, she leaned forward and said, "Mr. Kowalski, what you're describing is a pattern consistent with elder abuse. And I want to be honest with you about what you're facing. Your father has cognitive decline. If you confront your sister, and she denies it, and there's no documented evidence, you're in a very difficult position, legally. She has established residence at the property. Removing her isn't as simple as asking her to leave. So, what do I do?" "Document everything," she said. "Medical documentation of the bruises is important. Get him to his GP as soon as possible. And if something is happening at night, as you suspect, you need evidence of that. A security camera in a common area of his home, placed openly to document what's occurring, can be legally admissible. I want to be clear about something, because I know you're going to want to act fast. One incident on camera is useful. A pattern is irrefutable. Your sister's lawyer, if this goes to charges, will argue a single instance was an accident, a misunderstanding. If you can document multiple instances, that argument collapses." I heard what she was saying, and I understood it. Even though every part of me wanted to act that same afternoon, my father was being hurt. Every day I waited was another day he was at risk. But Patricia was right that moving too fast could leave him more exposed if Diane walked out with no charges and came back angrier. I had to do this carefully. I went to a technology shop on Paris Street and bought a small indoor security camera with night vision and motion-activated recording. I paid cash. I set it up in Dad's bedroom on the shelf above his dresser, behind a framed photograph of the two of us taken at a fishing camp in Temagami about 15 years ago. The lens was nearly invisible. If you weren't looking for it, you would never find it. I told my father what I was doing. I didn't want him to know everything. Didn't want him saying something to Diane that would tip her off. But I also wasn't going to hide it from him in his own bedroom. I sat with him alone on a Thursday afternoon while Diane was out running errands, and I said, "Dad, I want to put something up on your shelf that can keep an eye on your room at night, in case something happens and you need help." He looked at the camera in my hand and then at me, and he nodded once, slowly, and said, "Good." Just that word, good. And something about the way he said it made my throat tight. I set the camera and went home, and I waited. The first morning, I retrieved the memory card and brought it back to my house, and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, and I pressed play. There was my father's room in gray-green night vision, the hump of his blankets, the glow of the streetlight around the curtains. Nothing happened for almost 2 hours. Then at 1:14 the morning, the door opened. Diane came in wearing a housecoat, moving quietly. She walked to the side of Dad's bed, and she stood there for a moment looking down at him. I thought for one horrible relieved second that maybe she was just checking on him. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe she was just a light sleeper and she checked on him at night out of concern. Then she reached down and shook his shoulder, hard. Dad woke up confused, the way old people do when woken suddenly, trying to orient himself. He tried to push himself upright, and Diane put her hand flat against his chest and pushed him back down into the pillow. She leaned over him and began talking. The audio wasn't clear, but I could hear the tone of it. Low and sharp. The tone you use when you want to frighten someone without raising your voice. I could see Dad's face. I'd seen my father afraid exactly twice in my life before that moment. Both times involved genuine emergencies. This time, he looked at his daughter, and he was terrified. I caught fragments through the poor audio. The word ungrateful. The word difficult. Something about money. About how much it cost her to be there. How she'd given up her life. And then something that turned my stomach completely. You tell Walter anything, and I'll have you put away so fast they won't even let him visit. Do you understand me? They'll send you somewhere where nobody knows your name. She grabbed his wrist. His left wrist, the arm that had no bruise yet. She held it and said something close to his face, and I watched my father nod. Just nod. The way you nod at someone who has all the power over you and you have none. Then she left, closed the door behind her, and my father lay alone in the dark for a long time before his breathing slowed enough that he slept again. I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold, and I couldn't move. This was my sister, the girl I'd grown up with, who I'd taught to ride a bike on our street in Española when she was 6 years old, who'd stood beside me at our mother's funeral and squeezed my hand, who I'd helped move furniture for half a dozen times in her life because she never had enough money for movers, and I never minded. This was her, standing over our father in the middle of the night and frightening him into silence. I did not go to Diane's door that morning. I wanted to. I sat in my truck outside the house for 20 minutes before I trusted myself to go inside and see my father with my normal face on. I had oatmeal and coffee with him. He seemed exhausted. He didn't ask about the camera. He didn't mention the night. He just ate his oatmeal slowly and looked out the window at the snow. I let the camera run for 4 more nights. Patricia's voice in my head. A pattern is irrefutable. Each morning I retrieved the card, documented what I saw, saved the footage to an encrypted external drive I kept locked in my filing cabinet. Each night was some version of the same thing. Diane coming in at her chosen hour, her voice low and controlled and cruel. Dad trying not to react, trying to shrink into himself. Twice she physically handled him, grabbing his arm or yanking his shoulder. Not enough to leave dramatic marks, but enough that any doctor examining him would understand what had caused the bruising. On the 5th morning, I called Patricia and told her I had what we needed. I took Dad to his family physician, Dr. Beausoleil. That same afternoon, I'd called ahead and explained the situation, and she was ready for us. She examined Dad thoroughly and calmly, and she asked him, in the quiet voice of someone who does this well, whether anyone had ever heard him. Dad glanced at me, and I said, I already know, Dad. Doctor, Beausoleil needs to hear it from you. You're safe right now. And something shifted in him. Something let go. He talked for 15 minutes without stopping. He told her everything. He told her how long it had been going on, how frightened he was every night, how Diane had told him that if he spoke up, he'd lose the only family he had left. He cried at one point, quietly, the way men of his generation cry when they finally allow themselves to, and I sat beside him, and I held his hand, and I let him. Dr. Beausoleil documented everything. Photographs of the bruising, notes on his weight loss, a full written account of what he'd disclosed. Under Ontario's regulations, she filed a report with the local Adult Protective Services that same afternoon. Then she looked at both of us and said, Arthur, what's happening to you is not your fault. And it's not going to happen anymore. Patricia had also contacted the Greater Sudbury Police Service on my behalf. 2 officers came to Dad's medical clinic within the hour. They watched the footage I'd brought on my laptop. They looked at the medical report. They took our statements. And then one of them, a constable named Fournier, who had a calm and methodical manner I found reassuring, said, Mr. Kowalski, we're going to go to your father's residence now and arrest your sister. We'd like you and your father to come to the station separately to give formal statements. Are you both prepared for that? I looked at my father. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, and also, for the first time in months, like himself, like Arthur Kowalski, The man who built his own house with his own hands and never asked for anything he hadn't earned. Yes, Dad said, before I could answer. We're ready. Diane was at the house when the police arrived. I was told later that she denied everything initially. Said Dad was confused, that his dementia had caused him to misremember things, that I'd always been jealous of her relationship with our father, that the footage was taken out of context. I was told she was calm and convincing right up until Constable Fournier told her exactly how many nights of footage they had, and then she stopped talking entirely and asked for a lawyer. She was charged with assault of a person over 65, criminal harassment, and financial exploitation. That last charge came from the investigation into the shared account we'd set up for groceries and Dad's expenses. Diane had been withdrawing from it regularly in amounts well beyond what any reasonable household expense would justify. Patricia had flagged this to the police early on. In the months she'd been living at Dad's house, she'd taken nearly $9,000 more than she should have. Some of it was used to pay down her personal credit card debt. Our formal statements took most of the evening. The officers at the station were patient with Dad, let him take breaks when he needed to, offered him tea, asked their questions gently and without pressure. By the time we finished, it was dark outside, and I drove Dad home to his bungalow, and we sat at his kitchen table without turning on the overhead light, and we were both too tired for words. I should have told you sooner, he said, finally. Dad, I believed her. When she said you'd put me away, I believed her. I would never do that, I said. You know that, right? I would never do that. He looked at me across the table. I know, he said. I think I knew. But she said it so many times, it got inside me. That's what abuse does, I thought. It gets inside you. It makes you doubt the people who are actually safe. Diane was released on bail with a no-contact order. She went to stay with a friend in North Bay. I hired a woman named Ellen through a registered home care agency to come in 5 days a week to help Dad with meals and his daily routine. She was cheerful and professional, and within 2 weeks, Dad had started joking with her during breakfast, which told me everything I needed to know about his recovery. Melissa drove up from Ottawa the weekend after the arrest. She and I sat at Dad's kitchen table after he'd gone to bed, and she cried in a way I hadn't seen since Carol's funeral. She blamed herself for not being closer, for not visiting more, for not seeing what I'd seen. I told her what I genuinely believed, which was that Diane had been careful and deliberate, and that no one who wasn't looking closely would have caught it as early as I did, and even I had almost missed it. The Crown proceeded with all 3 charges. The criminal trial happened 8 months later at the Sudbury Courthouse on Elm Street. The Crown attorney, a man named Tremblay, who was thorough and unhurried, presented the video evidence, the medical documentation, Dad's testimony, and a financial audit of the shared account. Diane's defense argued that Dad's dementia made his testimony unreliable. The judge, clearly unmoved by this, pointed out that video footage does not have dementia. The jury was out for less than half a day. Guilty on all 3 counts. Diane received 20 months of house arrest to be served at a supervised residence, 3 years of probation, and a restitution order requiring her to repay the $9,000 she'd taken from our father. She was prohibited from working in any capacity with vulnerable adults. She was prohibited from contacting Dad or me. The bungalow was still in Dad's name, had always been in Dad's name. She left with what she'd arrived with, which wasn't much. I don't know where Diane is now. I know she's not in Sudbury. I've heard nothing from her since the verdict, and I expect that to continue. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I keep trying to find the thing that broke in her, the moment when she became capable of treating an 4-year-old man with dementia like an inconvenience to be managed and punished. Maybe it was the divorce. Maybe the financial pressure. Maybe something I never knew about. I've stopped expecting to find an answer that makes sense because I don't think one exists. Some things don't have an explanation that satisfies. They just are what they are. Dad is 85 now. He's still in his bungalow on the east side of Sudbury. Ellen comes every weekday. I come every single day, sometimes twice. His dementia has progressed somewhat, the way it does, regardless of what else is happening in your life. But his spirit has come back in ways I hadn't realized I'd been missing. He laughs at his hockey team the way he always did. He asks about Melissa's kids by name. He tells me the same story about a fishing trip to Chapelot in 1987, and I listen like it's new every time. Because for him it is. And because listening costs me nothing, and it means everything to him. There are mornings when he wakes up frightened, when something in a dream has confused the past with the present, and he's not sure where he is, or who's in the house. Ellen or I will sit with him until it passes. It always passes. He looks around the room, at the familiar walls of the house he built with his own hands 50 years ago, and he settles. "I'm okay," he'll say, when it clears. "I'm all right. I'm home." And he is. He's home. I'm sharing this because I need people to understand that elder abuse is not something that happens somewhere else, in other families, to people you don't know. It happens in ordinary homes, in ordinary cities across this country. It happens in Sudbury and in Halifax and in Medicine Hat and in every province and territory we have. It happens behind closed doors, in the middle of the night, when no one is watching, carried out by people who understand exactly how much their victims depend on them and exactly how much they have to lose by speaking up. The signs are often quiet. Unexplained bruises written off as clumsiness, an appetite that disappears. A person who was once confident and vocal, who has become small and watchful and afraid. A flinch when certain people enter the room. These things are not normal parts of aging. They are not inevitable. They are warnings. If you see them, act. Talk to the person when their caregiver isn't present. Ask your doctor about mandatory reporting obligations, because in Ontario and across Canada, certain professionals are required by law to report suspected elder abuse. Contact the Assaulted Women's Helpline or the Seniors Safety Line here in Ontario, which runs 24 hours a day. Contact your local police if you have reason to believe someone is in danger. Document what you observe. Write it down with dates. Photograph what can be photographed. Talk to a lawyer about your options before you confront anyone directly, because a confrontation without a plan can make things worse for the person you're trying to protect. And if you're the one being hurt, if you're the one lying awake at night afraid of the person who's supposed to be caring for you, please hear me say this. What is happening to you is not your fault. You are not a burden. You have not done anything to deserve this. You are a human being and you have rights, and there are people whose entire purpose is to help you exercise them. The Senior Safety Line in Ontario is 1-866-299-1011. You can call them. Someone will answer. Someone will listen. I set up a camera because I loved my father, and I couldn't prove what I knew was true. I waited 5 nights because my lawyer told me one incident could be explained away, and I was not willing to let Diane walk out of a courtroom free to come back. I know some people might hear that and say, I should have acted faster. And I understand that reaction completely. It's a reasonable thing to feel. But what I know now is that those 5 nights of footage are what put her in front of a jury without any possible defense. They are what gave my father the outcome he deserved, instead of a he said, she said that went nowhere. I made the choice I made because a partial result was not good enough for a man who trusted me to get it right. I got it right. That's what I hold on to. Dad asked me a few weeks after everything settled whether I was sorry about how it turned out with my sister. It's not a simple question, and I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I told him that I was sorry it had happened at all, that I was sorry she'd made the choices she made, that I grieved the sister I'd thought she was, even though it turned out she'd never quite been that person. But am I sorry I stopped her? Am I sorry I documented it, reported it, sat through a trial, watched her be found guilty? Not for a single second. My father is safe. He's in his house, the one he built himself, the one he's lived in for half a century. He is cared for and warm and as comfortable as a man with Alzheimer's can be. He knows his family loves him. On his good days, he knows it clearly. And those good days are still worth everything. Whatever it costs to get here, I'd do it again the same way. I'd do it faster. Please. If someone you love is showing you signs you can't explain, don't explain them away. Ask questions. Stay close. Trust the instinct that woke you up at 3 inches the morning and wouldn't let you go back to sleep. That instinct is trying to tell you something. Listen to it. It's trying to save someone,